it's kind of exciting to give life to a lot of legends and monsters that are talked about in everyday life in the culture that you're in. So I think that's like an exciting, like science fiction and fantasy is an exciting place to give life to these monsters. So many superstitions that are just like mentioned. I'm sure a lot of people just like take it for granted. Like once you're removed from that environment, you realize like how special they are. And in science fiction and fantasy, it's an exciting place to like give them a new life, explore them again, and also in that way to immortalize them because you are teaching new people about it that might not know of these stories, and they might be intrigued to look up something about it, to read more on it, or they might be enthralled by it, and it's another way to keep the culture alive in an engaging way.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 66 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me, as always, is my co-host, the Chewie to my Han Solo, the Joker to my Commander Shepard, MJ Kuhn. How's it going, MJ?
Hello, I am great. How are you?
I'm doing real great. And if you want to support MJ and her work, you can pick up Among Thieves, this sexy little book right here, and its sequel, Thick as Thieves. Because it's a duology, and they're both done, and you can binge it, and it's awesome, and you're going to love it. And thieves, and heists, and found family, and hatchets, and people swearing, and people dying. It's fucking awesome. Go pick it up. As well, a quick note for everyone out there listening or watching, the official SFF Addicts Patreon and merch store are live, so check the links in the description to support what we do here. And don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast app. And subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel, where this and every other episode of the show is available in full video. And now, joining us once again is none other than Gabriela Romero Lacruz, author of The Sun and the Void. Welcome back, Gabby. How's it going?
Thank you. I'm glad to be back.
Welcome. And heads up, this is part 2 of our 2-part chat with Gabby, so I recommend checking out part 1 to get to know her better. Today, though, we're taking a trip to the real world. Oh no. As we delve into a mini-masterclass on real cultures as inspiration. So just to start off this masterclass, we would like to know, for you personally, what does culture mean to you?
It's kind of like a blueprint of the people that came before you. Just kind of like a combination of the arts that make up your community and enrich your life, and just like add it. It's part of your identity. It adds to what you are.
Yeah.
So
That's
that
a beautiful description of culture.
Of music, food, beliefs, stories, customs, celebrations. Yeah.
That's one of the coolest things I think about traveling is you get to see other people's cultures and understand, or living in other places too.
See how other people live is very fascinating.
And the things that inspire them and influence them. Yeah. Why do you think that culture is so integral to humans and our personal collective identities, just kind of building on what you just said?
Well, it comes about from the result of self-expression, because culture kind of like becomes, it's like the collective of the arts. So communities have arts and beliefs, and that gets carried on through generations. And so that it just becomes like its own thing. It becomes a culture, Yeah,
it's kind of like this, I don't know. Living somewhere else, it kind of made me appreciate what it was like to grow up in Canada. Because Canada is one of those weird places where like the cultural identity of Canadians around the world is like, oh, you guys are nice. It's like Canadians are so kind, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you haven't fucking met Canadians before. We are passive aggressive as shit. And all the niceness is on the surface. And a lot of it is just boiling underneath.
Interesting you say that because I still think Canadians are nice.
Yes,
no, they are. No.
I just went to Canada this summer. I still think Canadians are pretty nice.
Canadians are nice, but we're also two-faced. No, this is also a generalization. All the Canadians out there are going to be like, yeah, maybe, but
they'll be like, Adrian, you're giving away our secrets.
Exactly. Don't tell. But I think it's really, really cool to meet individual people and to kind of see the things that shaped them. And then on top of that, to see the place that shaped them and to kind of understand like the different facets of how that puzzle piece worked together. And like, I think history is one of the craziest aspects of culture, because it's like we live now, but then so much of what we experience is based on things that have come from centuries and centuries and centuries before.
Yeah. And so many things of what we believe in and that shape our life, it has been created by someone that came before us. The victors of this and the writers of the stories, and like even the things that the ways you're educated and the things that you believe are written by the victors most of the time. And a lot of the literature, a lot of the music can have a certain point of view, and is the point of, I think we're going into like another topic here, but it's like, it's the point of view of like the dominant or whoever wrote the story, right?
Right.
And if you're surrounded in a place where like this is a certain voice that is writing the story, the majority voice, then it's very easy to like have a certain belief that might not have always been true. It's just kind of like the belief that's on top of the one that was before.
Yeah,
it's like
it totally makes sense.
Compounding beliefs and compounding history.
Mm-hmm.
And in history, like the victors, right? The dominant groups will rewrite history or omit parts of history that completely change the story, and that totally, I feel like, influences the greater culture. And I always say when I'm writing a new project, I create the world first, because I do think that the world and its history and its cultures influences everything else, right?
And how the character interacts in that world.
Yes, it's everyone is a product of their society in some way.
Mm-hmm. I want to get both your takes on this, because it's like there is this kind of thing where the victors are writing history and they have the power to omit so much stuff. But then like I've really loved those moments in history where like the counterculture or like the counter narrative ends up becoming so much more powerful and prominent than the people who tried to omit them. Like I'm just thinking about like music as a particular example, like in the United States where, people kind of attribute rock and roll to white people. It's like they think of Elvis and they think of like these bands that became really big, but it's like, no, rock and roll started with the like African American community and things like jazz, and the way that jazz and blues and all these different kinds of things like morphed and eventually became such a huge thing. But then obviously the opposing force came back to try and sort of steal the narrative from them with, musicians like Elvis and whatnot. But then now I feel like we're at a time where that recognition is coming back and there's more like appreciation for the voices that have been suppressed over the course of history.
Yeah, well, and if you live in America, then there's a very, very loud opposing voices that are terrified that we are trying to actually shed light on the stories that have been suppressed and are fighting back tooth and nail. And everything is, well, look at the news in Florida is all I'm gonna say about that. So yeah, it's all a mess.
You're a beautiful country.
Sure. We'll go with that.
It's just a beautiful, beautiful shit show. It's great.
Well, Gabby, I'm curious. Do you? We talked a little bit in part 1 of our 2-parter about your history with, getting interested in reading and coming to it from anime and fan fiction and video games and stuff like that. So I want to take all of fiction, so it doesn't have to be book; it can be any form. Do you remember the first time you remember noticing culture, or even like a lack of culture, or a different culture, or something from your own in fiction?
In fiction? Uh, well, I would say like growing up in Venezuela, like the culture is shown in like the telenovelas and the dramas that are on the TV show. It's contemporary culture exists in what's being shown on the TV. So yeah, I didn't really notice. I mean, I grew up in Venezuela, so it's like I took a lot of things for granted about the things that I knew. But even having grown up in Venezuela, I had um, the things that I knew were not also the whole picture. Um, it's just like a lot to unpack here. Let's just say like the educational materials have a certain lens to how the story is told, and I accepted that. But then later on, as I'm reading more things about the culture, that I'm realizing that everything had a very like Spanish centric point of view, and other smaller ethnic cultures were being disregarded, right? Um, so I have this idea that we have a very homogeneous culture, because when I came to the US, I noticed how there's so many different cultures, and they're very starkly different. But also, it's not true to say that we're a homogeneous culture in Venezuela. There's also like very different groups that have their own unique experiences and cultures, and it just so happens that like the majority has been shaped by more of like an European lens, is what I would say. So Venezuelan culture, I experienced it in telenovelas, but like in fantasy, um, I don't think I did when I was there. And coming here, anytime Venezuela was brought up, it was like, I don't know, like just mentioned as like the guerrilla group in some action movie, like, oh, the Venezuelans have overtaken the base. Like that's literally the only
any like
that
Tom
we
Clancy, whatever.
yeah. So I don't know. It's too much, guys. It's too deep.
It's
Come on.
too deep. It's too deep. No, yeah. Well,
There's too many layers. There's too many layers to unpack here.
There's so much, you know what I mean? There's so many places we could go with it. But like, let's bring it back to The Sun and the Void and your projects. And what is it about fantasy or even sci-fi? Because I know you mentioned in part 1 that you had written a YA sci-fi before you wrote Sun and the Void. What is it about those genres that makes them kind of a fitting baseline, I guess, to create cultures that are inspired by real world cultures, do you think?
Well, it's kind of exciting to give life to a lot of legends and monsters that are talked about in everyday life, in the culture that you're in. So I think that's like an exciting, like science fiction and fantasy is an exciting place to give life to these monsters. And like for example, I would love one day to read or write a story that highlights the horror stories of El Silbón. It's like the most well-known like horror creature in Venezuela. Everyone knows about El Silbón is like a infamous legend. Or like the mamoys, which are like this little like duendes. How do I say that? Like little
they're like
dwarves.
no, they're like gnomes,
Like,
kind of thing.
no, thank you.
Yeah. No, my mother-in-law, like mi suegras, like she's always talking about duendes. Like, don't leave the baby's clothes outside because the duendes will come and steal it. I'm just like,
Yes.
Oh my God, I love that.
There's like, go fucking take those little baby socks and put them on my feet.
Oh my gosh. There's so like so many superstitions that are just like mentioned. I'm sure a lot of people just like take it from granted. Like the people in your community, Adriana, like the superstitions like they just exist. And might be taken for granted, but like once you're removed from that environment, you realize like how special they are. And in science fiction and fantasy, it's an exciting place to like give them a new life, explore them again, and also in that way to immortalize them, because you are teaching new people about it that might not know of these stories, and they might be intrigued to look up something about it, to read more on it, or they might be enthralled by it, and it's another way to keep the culture alive in an engaging way. Yeah, it's very exciting. I think there's a lot of potential.
MJ, I want to get your take on that too, because it's like you mentioned earlier that you like to approach it from like creating the world first as your sort of baseline. But yeah, why do you think that's the case in terms of fantasy and sci-fi being such fertile ground?
Yeah, I think it is because, I mean, in a lot of, if you're looking at fantasy particularly, which is what I've written so far, you know, oftentimes, not always, it's kind of set in a historical second world, right? Where it's not, modern day second world. Again, there are examples where it is. And I think that in most cultures, when you go back really far in history, there is often this blending of myth and history that kind of walk hand in hand, and you see these kind of the blurring of those lines. And I do think that fantasy is a fun environment where you can blur those lines, and like, why don't we have just monsters existing side by side with people? Why can't we have gods that come down and actually walk among people? I really think that it just lends itself well to exploring that kind of phenomenon of early world history across cultures where you have that blending.
Yeah, because it's like the perfect situation where you can use real world inspiration, but in such a way where it's like contained within something that is not real, but is allegorically so potent in terms of what we experience day to day. Like I'm thinking, okay, like I have two examples. So the first one is Altered Carbon by Richard K. Morgan.
Yeah.
And that one, the author said some really shitty stuff about trans people, and it's like, that's unacceptable. But I'm just going to use this as an example, his book as an example, in the sense that Altered Carbon uses a science fictional setting and the way that technology and humans could combine in the future in terms of transhumanism to portray corporate culture and portray billionaires and these kinds of people as literal transhuman gods living in skyscrapers above the clouds, kind of
indefinitely,
thing.
forever.
Interposed with the people who are living down below and their shitty lives and the stuff that they have to deal with, and the fact that they are not able to afford meals, let alone the ability to augment their bodies and extend their lifespans and stuff like that. And so it's really amazing that science fiction is able to do that kind of thing. And then on the flip side, it's like you have something like Game of Thrones, which Gabby, you mentioned in the last episode, is one of the things that kind of like really pulled you into fantasy, where George R. R. Martin is taking things like the War of the Roses and using that as a very, like some people might say like copy and paste, but I don't think it's copy and paste, because he is
it's just heavily inspired. Yeah,
heavily inspired, and it's someone who's passionate about something that happened in history. And it's really cool that fantasy and sci-fi authors can take these things and transpose them into fictional settings and alternate universes and secondary worlds and all this kind of stuff to, I don't know, just like give us an opportunity to think about things in our real world that we often ignore.
Because maybe in some cases we wouldn't know about it otherwise.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's just a connection for a hungry and curious reader to discover more. When I was growing up, I was, like I said, obsessed with anime and video games. And I learned so much of Japanese culture because they show their culture in their stories, the creators of anime. And I was just intrigued, like, oh, so what does this mean? So let me look it up. Or what is this historical period? What happened? And it's something that I wouldn't know otherwise. But it piqued my interest. An export of their country. And you can see now the kind of effects that it's had on the popularity of Japanese stuff all over the world. They've exported so much science fiction and fantasy, capturing the minds of so many viewers and readers that we are all in love with, and we want to go to Japan and we want to consume everything Japanese. Like, there's been a boom, right, of people going there, and I love.
They even have like terms for it, like weeaboo and shit like that. It's like
liking anime is mainstream now, but I remember back in the day when it was not.
Yeah, back in the 90s, where it's like, I don't want to talk to like people at school about like Dragon Ball Z, or I don't want to talk to them about like, I went to the theater to see Pokemon on the opening night, and just like, stuff like that, where it's like, I feel like the growth of the internet over our lifetimes has really opened people's eyes to the commonalities that they share.
Yeah.
But also what you said, Gabby, in terms of being able to see something and then just do like a deep dive into it.
Right.
And just be like, this culture seems fascinating to me, and I'm just going to fucking sink myself into it and go down like a Wikipedia vortex and just really, really learn about that kind of stuff in ways that never in human history have been possible.
Yeah. And it's kind of cool because, so I don't read my reviews, but my husband does, and he shares with me like the good ones. And he's been like, oh, there's so many people who I never would have thought about Venezuela, or like don't think about going to eat arepas, and you're inspiring them to go and do that, and that's what we do by creating these stories, these engaging stories that are drawing from real life cultures. It's a spreading of the culture and immortalization of it. More people are going to be exposed to it and hopefully maybe drawn to it, and they could come and explore it more. So I think it's just like a overall win for the culture of humanity.
Yeah. And it's like an immortalization of your experience too.
Mm-hmm.
Not just like the culture itself, but you as like a human being who's been influenced by that culture and the things that you love. And the fact, like, I love that. It's like, I can just picture someone being like reading this book and be like, I'm going to go look up like a Venezuelan restaurant and see what I can buy, like see what kinds of foods I can try and all that kind of stuff. Cause it's like, damn girl, you've described food so well.
Thank you.
Oh,
it's so good.
You get so hungry when I'm reading some parts.
I'm like, this feast. God damn, that is like, MJ and I love Redwall, and it's like Redwall is all about the feast.
Yeah.
I feel like
a good fantasy book
of
feast scene is
anime just does like food so well. I just have like images burned into my brain of like, Howl's Moving Castle, where Calcifer is like has a frying pan on top of him and they're cooking eggs. I'm like, that looks like the most delicious fucking egg in existence.
Did
like,
you watch Spirited Away?
And Spirited Away, and like the way that
so much food.
Yeah, so much food. Oh my god.
So much beautiful food.
Yeah. Oh damn. Yeah. For anyone,
I need to snack, you guys. Come on.
You haven't been snacking this whole time, MJ.
I know I haven't. Not this episode. Now I need a snack.
Okay. Well, Gabby, let's dig deeper into, on the topic of food, but broadly speaking, world building how did you approach the world building for The Sun and the Void? And what were some of the elements that hit you first? And then how did you build upon that using the inspirations from Venezuelan culture, history, folklore, that kind of stuff?
So the first things that I did were the easy things, which was like the races and the magic system. But as far as like making the world seem real, I wanted to give it like this historical background that it had a revolution, it has the heroes from the independence, because that's something that's very similar to Venezuelan culture. Like we idolize a lot of the heroes from the revolution, like their names are everywhere, the names of schools, streets, plazas. And I wanted to also show that in this world. I think that gives it like a more grounded feeling, and it gives it like a cool historical background to add more characters. And I wanted to add the sense that these nations were like freshly created, like after being freed from colonization. But really, to give it like a grounding sense, I really like delved into música llanera, and this is a genre of music from the llanos of Venezuela and Colombia. And the lyrics are so folkloric, like they just talk about like a very pastoral way of life. These are ranchers. They work in haciendas, and they work in like they handle cattle, they grow cattle, raise cattle, and and
They grow them, sort of.
yeah.
Yeah.
It works.
And like the lyrics of the music is very pastoral, very personal. Like they talk about like a very humble like day-to-day life, and the struggles of like finding like the lover, or like encounters with the devil, and like seeing spirits and ghosts. And I feel like that just gives like a very it just I knew it was going to give me a very grounding idea of what this world probably felt like if it was in the 1800s. Like there's no electricity, there's so much like superstition and myths that are people believe in so different things. So I was just listening to música llanera to kind of like get a sense of how it would feel to be in this world, and I tried to add some of that, put like little bits and pieces into the lore. Like when I created the lore, I was inspired by it. And I created my own lore and added it to the world so that it would feel like this was, you know, Venezuela like many years ago in a fantasy setting. And I think that's like one of the biggest things that I did to give it a grounding feeling. And obviously like the trying to get the clothing and the food, and it was also very important to me to show Venezuela in like a positive light in media. I feel like Venezuela is often used as an example or a topic for a lot of polarizing discussions, and um, it's not often like talked about in a positive way. So I wanted to give a glimpse of like so much beauty that we have, and that's why I wanted to include like different biomes and geographies um, in this world, because we do have such beautiful beaches and beautiful mountains and beautiful prairies and jungles, and we even have a desert. We have so much, and the world really has no idea. And I want more people to know about it. So I just want it to be like an escape, like a beautiful escape, and I try to give it like a grounding sense when I created this world. I tapped into some of my memories of growing up in Venezuela, and whenever my dad is from the coast, so I would go to the beach and stay in his hometown, his little beach town, like so many summers. My mom is from the Andes, and I spent so many years in the Andes as well, and going up to the Paramo. So I try to imbue that into the writing so that the reader could be transported and also experience that. and realize that we have like a paradise just there.
Yeah, it definitely comes through. I mean, the world is so immersive. It is so immersive in this story.
I'm curious because like MJ, I want to get your kind of take on this as someone who's read this, because it's like for me, this has probably been one of the most, in recent memory, one of the most like intensely personal feeling worlds that I've ever immersed myself into. In terms of like, I've come to Ecuador, I've immersed myself in the culture, I've learned the language, I've lived here for so many years, and this is the first time that I've read fantasy where I was like, holy shit, like the way that you describe the biomes and the geography. It's like I'm up in the Andes in Quito, and for anyone who like in terms of geography, it's like and history as well, like Simon Bolivar united many different countries, like parts of Brazil, Venezuela, Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, and parts of Peru into a giant independent country called Gran Colombia. And so Gran Colombia is like, there's so much shared history between places like Ecuador and Venezuela that for me, it's like, even though I'm from Canada and I live in Ecuador, but you're from Venezuela and now you live in the States, there's so much that I was able to take out of this that felt really personal to me in terms of like walking through the Paramo and seeing like frailejones, like these trees that I've seen so many times, and just being like, that image is so burned into my mind that I'm like, holy shit. Or the food, even though the food it varies a lot over across South America, but like so many things that are shared, like arepas and like stews and all different kinds of stuff, like goat stew and things like that. And the shared history for me felt so personal that I was able to like immerse myself, I think, more than a lot of books have allowed me to do, just because it's like, I'm passionate about this country. I love it. Like I can fucking drive like 2 hours in either direction, and it's like I go to like a cloud forest in one direction and then towards the coast, or it's like in the other direction, I'm literally in the Amazon in 2 hours. Or it's like I go like to so many different kinds of biomes, and it's fucking wild, and people don't understand the beauty of these places. Like before I moved to Ecuador, people were like, where is that? Like Africa?
Oh my gosh.
And I'm just like, what the fuck?
Don't get me started how many times I've been asked, what part of Africa is that?
Or like I tell them like, it's actually like where Galapagos is, and people are like, oh, I had no idea Galapagos was like a part of Ecuador. And then like with Venezuela, the way that it's portrayed in media, it's like, yes, because of its communist history and Hugo Chavez and all these different people who have basically been counter to what we see as like Western democracy, it's been villainized, and the country went through a really hard time when it crashed, and Hugo Chavez dying, and like everything being passed on to his brother, and all this shit happening. But it's like, you see Venezuelans as like guerrilla fighters, terrorists, and all this kind of shit. And it's like, for me, to see you be able to portray your country in a way that is positive is so beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. I was really driven to show that. I was really driven to show it in a positive light, because I moved to the US, but I would always come back to spend my summers here, in Venezuela. And it was like, man, this is paradise. This is heaven. Like, and no one knows about it, and no one believes me. And so I just always wanted to show people Venezuela, and this is a cool way to do it. As a writer, I'm able to immerse a reader in the world, and hopefully get them inspired into looking up more things. Yeah.
MJ, what was your take as someone who's like much more separated from this?
Well, that's what I say. I'm a complete, outsider from the culture entirely. I've never, traveled to South America. I don't have a ton of knowledge of the culture there at all. So this was like what you're saying, Gabby, where you want to introduce people to the culture. Hi, you introduced me to the culture, because it was just, something I had not been exposed to really before. I knew a little. So my brother-in-law's roommate in college was from Venezuela. So, like arepas and stuff like that. Like he's taken the recipes from his roommate. So like some of the food was familiar to me just through that. But yeah, it was just a really cool introduction to a part of the world that I have not been to. I got to like transport my mind, you know what I mean, to something very heavily inspired, and I loved that. But I
Thank you.
want to know because it is so immersive. Like I for anyone that hasn't read the book yet, first of all, what are you doing? Go get it and read it. It's great. But just for myself as a writer, and I know we have a lot of writers that listen to the show as well. I want to pick your brain about your world building process because clearly it's fantastic because you've created something that feels so real and immersive. What like tools do you use? How much do you know before you start drafting? Like, are you more of a pantser or do you really plan out your world before you get started? How do you organize your thoughts and ideas? Like, just indulge me a little.
I'm a heavy planner and I have extensive outlines and I have extensive world building encyclopedias that I build as I go along. And I did that for this book just because it was a bit challenging to keep track of everything, and I just needed a quick way to search for something. So if I drop something in my draft, then it would also go into like my world building document. But prior to drafting, while I'm doing the outlining, I want the world to have an impact on the characters. So I think being inspired by like whatever my inspiration was or is, I try to imbue that into the world building such that it also impacts the plot and the characters. So there's a little bit of research that goes into it. Well, not I'm doing that a little more in book two because I want to just kind of like see like there's a little more any more folklore that I can draw from and to solve some of my plot kinks, and yeah, I don't know where I was going with this, but like doing a little bit of research will help inspire. And then I what I try to do is I don't want to grab the same stories that exist in the folklore. I want to creatively imagine something that would be similar. So, for example, Chess's blade is able to cut nighttime, like that's the his legend. Um, that's not really like a story that I found anywhere, but like as I was reading like different legends and myths, I just wanted to create something that it would have like that similar fantastical feel, like almost like abstract and surreal. Because a lot of the folklore and myths have like kind of like a surreal feel, like the way the legends are resolved is like, oh, and so like stepped on the town and the town was shattered and destroyed, like, and it's supposed to be like a metaphor for an earthquake that happened or something like that. So it's just like very surreal things make up the folklore that gave me my inspiration. So I try to write or try to make like little different um, snippets and backgrounds that felt that same way. Or like, for example, I have this story of Princess Marle who discovered the river by like riding on her jaguar that raced her. It's something like a story that I came up with, but that has kind of like a surreal feeling inspired by actual folklore, you know? Or even the whole like testing for the damas, which is like kidnapping babies. The myths of like witches kidnapping babies are almost everywhere, and it's a prevalent of Venezuelan culture as well. uh I don't know, maybe it's like rooted in Catholicism. I don't know where it comes from, but like a lot there's a lot of cultures across the world have a similar spin to that. So in the Son of the Void, you actually have a witch that's kidnapping babies, literal witch, for her ritual. So um, I don't know, just rewriting and making it seem similar.
Yeah.
I kind of want to elaborate on this a bit because I love this dichotomy between like things that are inspired by cultures, but then as fantasy and science fiction authors is like we want to invent stuff too. We want to kind of make it our own. We want to put a twist on it and make it feel a little bit more like ours. But what would you say to other authors in terms of like where they can draw the line between those two things, or at least kind of offer something where, you know, they feel comfortable approaching history and real world cultures without hesitation about like, you know, pulling aspects of this and kind of morphing it into something that is their own?
Um, this is. Can you be a little more specific? Like drawing from other cultures.
No, we'll get that. We'll get to that in a little bit. But in terms of like that balance between things that are inspired by a culture, whether it's your own, whether it's another one, versus the things that authors invent themselves, like what you were talking about in terms of like taking these things from folklore and kind of putting your own twist on them, just kind of drawing that inspiration, but not being like a one-to-one exact kind of copy.
Right. I think the end goal is also important to consider. Like, what kind of feel are you trying to achieve in the story itself? And then seeing if, like, try to molding the story, the using your creativity. I would implore people to use the creativity to, if they want to create those stories that would go into the world that they're trying to build, in order to reach the end goal. So what is the final feel that you want for the world? And then creating stories and pieces, creating mythos of your own. I don't know. I created a lot from scratch, but I wanted to make it feel like it belonged in the world as well. So it was an inspiration of like flavor and aesthetic, um, rather than a one-to-one inspiration of grabbing the stories themselves. So I wanted the end product to feel a certain way, and I guess it was easy for me because I grew up in Venezuela and I know what like growing up like what the culture feels like. So I wasn't like drawing huge tangents to what the end product I want it to look like. But I still made up my own stories. I still
Yeah.
made up like the mythos of the world, you know.
Right. Just gave it that same vibe, for lack of better word, for what you were looking for. I love that.
Yeah.
It's
I
all
want
about
to
the
get
vibes, MJ.
it is. It's all about the vibes, man. I want to get a little deeper into research, because clearly you did quite a bit of research. You said you're doing more for book 2. And I know some of it is, you know, based on your own experiences, which I feel like is like lived research. I feel like it counts. I'm just curious how important research has been to you, you know, crafting the story based on a real culture. And are there research pitfalls that you've fallen into, or, you know, have you found yourself struggling with some stuff? Just like a heads up, a warning if a writer wants to, you know, craft a story based on their culture.
Right. Yeah, I something just came up into my like came up to my mind. I was double checking a lot of the things that I grew up with my family and people in my community. But I also discovered that you have to kind of like have multiple sources for where you get the information, because someone's account might be biased or just straight up wrong, or it's just like what they did in their family or what they did in the street where they grew up with, but it's not like the actual root of why something is a certain way. Um, yeah, so small little details I would like ask my mom, like, oh, what, for example, there's a drink called mistela, and I remember that in my family, whenever someone was born, we would or someone would like make like a little bit of the drink, and it's an alcoholic drink of anise and like a fruit, like strawberry juice, and just bring it to like wherever the pregnant woman is, like the family, and it's just gift it, and like you share it with the people that are, you know, meeting the baby for the first time, maybe not the mom. Anyways, and I was just like trying to like check that, and I could not find if anyone else was doing this. So, like, is it just like a family thing, or is it actually like the broader culture does? But also, you can't disregard something that just your family does, because that is culture as well.
Right.
Yeah.
It's one of the most intimate forms of culture.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess where I'm trying to go with this is, it's like really exciting to find multiple sources for the same thing, just to enrich the material that you're looking for. And it might lead you to like new exciting places. I mean,
yeah, because we talked to Ronnie Verdi recently about the hero's journey and how that ties into storytelling tradition and oral storytelling, and how stories evolve over time and space. And basically it's like shit's malleable, you know, like tradition is malleable, culture is malleable from one family to the next. It's like their recipe for arepas could be a little bit different.
yeah.
Their certain like familial traditions are different. It's like music shifts from place to place as well. So it's kind of cool to be able to have like, I like that you approach it from like multiple sources, because it what that will give you is a depth of comparison, and that will give you more context for how these things can evolve. And I think as fantasy and sci-fi writers, it's kind of cool to think like that gives you a little bit of flexibility to make it a bit more personal, a bit more your own at the same time. You know?
Well, it reminds me of what you said at the very beginning of this episode, Gabby, where you talked about culture being a blueprint from the people that came before you, which I just thought was such a beautiful description of culture. And then if you think about it on like a long scale timeline, someday we will be the people that are creating a portion of that culture, right?
Yeah,
a portion
definitely.
of that blueprint for the people that come after us.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a very cool way to kind of look at how your story can fit into, you know what I mean, building a new culture moving forward. I think it's great.
Yeah.
And we touched on it a little bit earlier. And this is a bit of a tricky topic, but I want to get your thoughts on all three of us can discuss this, but thoughts on writers drawing inspiration from cultures that are not their own, and you know how writers might best avoid cultural appropriation and instead approach other cultures with something that I personally try to do myself, and try to approach other cultures with appreciation and respect, and just learn as much as you can, and like you're saying, like compare and contrast like how different people are doing things, and let that kind of fold into your own personal experiences. So what are your thoughts on that, where it's like writers drawing inspiration from cultures that are not their own?
Well, I think it's important to examine like the reason why they are doing it. Is it like is there a passion for the culture itself? Like, is there a passion to keep the beliefs alive, to spread the customs and the music and the sayings and the art? Or is it just as like fodder because you can't be creative? Like, what is the actual reason? And in one, like, if it's like a passion, I feel like that's like you're like an appreciation of the culture. And I think this topic has become tricky recently is because a lot of people have done it carelessly in ways that depict other cultures in a negative lens, or in a lens where like the viewers will have a incorrect opinion of the culture that's being depicted,
or a generalization of that culture.
Right, stereotypical
where
view.
so that's kind of, I think that's one of the reasons why it's like a problem nowadays, when it's not done carefully, and when the all the layers are examined as to why that culture is the way it is, and instead it's just used as, you know, inspiration because the writer can't come up with like their own mythos and folklore. I think as writers, we have a lot of power. And what we're doing is ultimately it's just like making things up. So why not make more things up instead, and instead like draw from something else? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause it's like, yeah, that using other cultures as like set dressing shit pisses me off so much. Cause it's like, you're basically just taking like stereotypes about that culture and just kind of applying it to whatever kind of story you want to tell, and it's lazy. Like I think a lot of it comes down to either like laziness or a misdiagnosis of like what that culture is actually about, and then making making pervasive stereotypes within the industry, and then those end up bleeding out into like readers and into culture. And that's how so many shitty stereotypes exist now, like Venezuelan terrorists or like guerrilla warfighters, is because of the way media has stereotyped and perpetuated
and it's created by
perceptions.
people that are not immersed in it.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So it's like this, like the world that I'm working in right now, and like the book that I'm going to be releasing next year, is inspired by Japan and my love of Japan. It's like I grew up with anime. I grew up with Japanese video games and JRPGs and all these different kinds of things. But I'm also super, super passionate and nerdy about Japanese history and learning about the ways in which Japanese society and culture has progressed. And it's like using that as an inspiration, and then blending that with mushrooms and mushroom people, and creating this
Fungal
world
punk.
that fungal punk, baby.
Yeah.
And basically creating this world that is an homage to Japan, a respectful homage based on a place that I love and have actually visited, and you know, feels real to me and feels personal to me, but is also a reflection of this place that I adore. And like, you know, I hope when people read the books that they feel that as well, and not necessarily like so much stuff that has just pervaded science fiction and fantasy over time, where it's like, you know, dwarves are basically just like built on a stereotype of Jewish people, and like all this different kind of shit that has made people's opinions really sour and gotten us to this point where things are way more sensitive. Yeah.
I think if it's an appreciation, like a true passion for it, then the writer will be less likely to like fall into those like easy traps of like making stereotypes or generalizing, you know?
Mm-hmm. MJ, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, my take, and it is a tricky topic. My take in general, every time I have an idea for a story, I ask myself several questions, and one of the ones I ask myself is, am I the right person to tell this story? Because just because I have an idea that could be a great story doesn't mean that it's a great story that I should write. You know what I mean? And I think that that's something that people need to do and be careful about, and stuff like that. You know, I guess I don't necessarily really have a great answer to the question.
It's not so much about like writing it itself. Like the writing part is not as harmful. The harmful part is when you start publishing it and distributing it to like a wider audience.
Yeah.
I feel like writing is a personal thing, and writers choose what they put out into the world, and some things just stay for ourselves. And it's a way to like process things or explore things that we want to explore, but that doesn't mean that it has to be the thing that furthers human culture, which is what we're doing whenever we publish a book.
Yeah, because then it goes into the record of... Yeah,
it's like when you put something on the internet, it's there forever. It's kind of similarly way, you know, like when you put out like a story, publish it, print it, then it's there. People are reading it. Now you are incepting their minds with
Yeah.
your ideas that you had. And if your ideas were harmful, then you're only perpetrating that harmful.
Yeah. I think it's like the difference between like, you know, not necessarily like you have to tread carefully. It's like, no, walk and write with purpose and, you know, think about the shit that you're putting down into words and think about what that will be like when you put it out into the world. And it's like,
Yeah.
if you're purposeful about these things, if you're respectful and passionate, then I think people will kind of catch on to that and understand where you're coming from. Whereas if you're coming from a place of laziness or sort of like discriminatory angle or perpetuating stereotypes and stuff like that, then people will also catch on to that shit, and they're more likely to be like, oh, come on, like.
Yeah. Well, and there's always
why?
Resources, right? Like sensitivity
Yeah.
readers exist.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, I definitely think if someone's going to attempt to write a story based on or inspired by a culture outside of their own, they need to avail themselves of resources like sensitivity readers to prevent accidentally, you know what I mean, perpetuating something because they don't fully understand, because it's not their culture. Yeah. Well, I think this has been a really fascinating conversation. I think we've gotten some really great insights from you, Gabby. This has been so great, and I think it's going to be really helpful for our listeners. You know, when they're crafting their worlds based on real cultures. Do you have a final piece of advice that you can give to authors looking to take, you know, their family's real life culture and translate it into a fantasy or a sci-fi world?
I don't know. I feel like I've given a lot of advice already.
I know, I was going to say, we're greedy. We already got so much advice. We're like, we want more.
Are we able to cut out like the time that we're thinking here?
Or we can keep it in for dramatic effect.
Right?
No,
it's a drum roll.
Oh, I didn't think about this.
No, it's great.
It's all good.
Do it passionately. Like, even like everyone's stories matters. Like everyone has their own culture. Every household has their own culture, and if you're trying to share that with someone else, then do it in a way that will be enticing, it will be appealing, that will further human culture.
Yeah, and if it's like if you're passionate about it, like you're probably writing it for yourself, and at that point, everyone else is going to be like, "Fuck yeah, this is awesome." I mean, not everybody else, but there will be
but
an audience for it.
Right? The right people.
Yeah,
the
exactly.
people that your story is meant to enrich. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is it for this mini masterclass and our two-parter with Gabriela. Muchísimas gracias for hanging out with MJ and I and just sharing everything that you've experienced and you know, your writing journey and all that. This has been a ton of fun, so I really, really appreciate it.
This has been really fun.
Yay!
Yeah, and as well, for anyone who contributes to our Patreon at $10 or more a month, there'll be a reading by Gabby from The Sun and the Void, so go check that out. Go pick up the book. It's fantastic. Support debut authors, support authors and their work. I believe the UK edition will be out by the time this episode goes out, so it's August 15th. So if you're in the US, UK, both of them have awesome covers.
Yeah.
And inside is a fantastic book. So just pick it up and enjoy. Gabby, where can people find you on social media?
If you're interested in my books and writing life, I am Gabriela Romero Lacruz. In Instagram, Twitter, G Romero Lacruz, and TikTok, I'm also Gabriela Romero Lacruz. As far as my illustration, the Moonborn everywhere.
All right, perfect. And you can also follow SFF Addicts on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads at sffaddictspod, or you can follow me at Adrian M. Gibson. MJ, where can people find you?
Yep, you can find me across all the socials at MJ Kuhn Books.
All right, and go pick up Among Thieves. go get Thick as Thieves. Support MJ's work as well. She's fantastic. So just support your authors, man. These are beautiful people doing beautiful things, writing beautiful books. So keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.